Hi, this is Zibby Owens, and you're listening to the award-winning podcast, Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. I'm also the host of Moms Don't Have Time to Lose Weight, and I'm the editor of the anthology, which you should run out and buy, called Moms Don't Have Time to, a quarantine anthology. All proceeds of that book go to COVID-19 vaccine research. And I'm the editor-in-chief of Moms Don't Have Time to Write, a new publication on Medium, and we're accepting submissions, so please send your personal essays there. And if all that isn't enough, you can follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens, and my website is zibbyowens.com. Okay, now back to this amazing podcast. Claire Lombardo is the author of the novel The Most Fun We Ever Had. Claire is a novelist, teacher, and Post-it enthusiast. Her first book, The Most Fun We Ever Had, was an instant New York Times bestseller and has been translated or is forthcoming in over a dozen languages. The novel is being adapted for a series to be written by Claire and co-produced by Amy Adams and Laura Dern, which I'm realizing now I forgot to ask her about, so sorry about that. Claire is a graduate of the University of Illinois, Chicago, and the Iowa Writers Workshop. Her short fiction has appeared in, among other things, Playboy, Barrel House Magazine, Little Fiction, and Longform. Her story, I Only Want to Talk About the Nice Things, was one of 2016's Best of the Net and was number one on Longform's 2015 fiction list. Prior to writing The Most Fun We Ever Had, Claire spent several years working with homeless children and families in Chicago. She has also been a dog walker, a nanny, a temp, and a communications aide at a woodwind nonprofit. Think flute. She is not herself a woodwind musician. A native of Oak Park, Illinois, she now lives in Iowa City, Iowa, with her dog, Renee. Welcome, Claire. Thanks so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So tell me about The Most Fun We Ever Had, the process of writing that book, how that became a book, and take me up to today.
Oh, sure.
Take your time.
Yeah. So,
I'll just settle in.
The tall order. I'll just talk a lot. No, The Most Fun We Ever Had. Do you want me to describe the book or do you want me to just talk about
Well, yes. For people who don't know what it's about, give a short description.
Sure. So The Most Fun We Ever Had is it's a multi-generational family story about the Sorensen family who lived in the Chicago suburbs. And the book follows this family, this couple and their four sort of errant daughters for over 50 years, or almost 50 years. And so at its core, it's sort of about this ironclad marriage between these two people. And then it's sort of all the things that come from that. So that's my elevator pitch. And so, yeah, I started writing this book, I don't know, 9 years ago. It's been a really long time. I was 24, 8 years ago. So I was working on this book when I was in graduate school to be a therapist. So I thought, and it was so sort of all-consuming and the thing that I cared about so much that I ended up dropping out of graduate school. And I ended up very, very fortunately at the Iowa Writers Workshop a couple of years later. And spent the next few years working on this book. And then I met my editor at Doubleday, and here we are. Yeah, it takes a really, this as well. It takes a really long time to publish a book. It is a long process. Thankfully, a fairly entertaining and pleasant one. But so the book came out almost 2 years ago. It's coming out in paperback in a few weeks, which is really kind of exciting to breathe new life into it. So it's been a long 8 or so years. Yeah.
And how did you arrive? How did you come up with those the characters in the family and decide that was the type of first novel you wanted to write?
This novel started out as a short story about one of the characters, Violet, who is this woman who has placed a child for adoption very young and then kind of curates this ostensibly picture-perfect life for herself. She has 2 little kids. She and her husband live on the North Shore of Chicago, and everything is kind of arranged to very specific specifications. And then the kid comes back as a teenager. And I was really, really interested in that dynamic in life kind of getting in the way as it often does, but specifically in that way. And then from there, I just sort of her family kind of took over and I became really obsessed with her. She had sort of a larger than life sister, and then these parents who were sort of crazily in love with each other and slightly more accepting of the messiness of life. So the book just kept growing. I'm from a big family. This is not an autobiographical novel by any stretch, but I'm very sort of interested in family dynamics and always have been. So it kind of evolved from there, kind of my obsession with other people, I guess. Yeah.
What number child are you? Of how many?
I am the youngest of 5.
Oh, wow.
So yeah. And I kind of, I was a very quiet kid. And I remember one of my sisters saying once, I was always like I was always very quiet and not ever saying much, but she was like, we knew that you were listening. Like there was, something going on. So yeah, I was fascinated by my older sisters. And so, yeah, that certainly influences me as a writer.
And are you close with your siblings?
I am, yeah, all of them in different ways. And I feel about them the way I sort of feel about my characters, which is that I like them all to different degrees on different days, which I think is the case for most people. I hope that's the case for most people. But yes, they're all writerly and creative in different ways. So it's been nice to have, readers in my family as well. So
that's great. I feel like so much advice people give is sort of like getting a group of readers or like-minded people. But if it comes baked into your own family, how great is that?
Sure, right? It's very convenient.
And tell me a little more about Iowa, because I hear so much about it and it just seems like, I don't know, so magical. And, what is it like, exclusive? What is it like being there?
Yeah. So I was so terrified when I got here because I had heard, all sorts of stories as well. And I also felt just like massive imposter syndrome when I got here. Like it was surely a mistake that I had gotten in. And I remember my first day of workshop, I was in the novelist Ethan Kanan, who later became my mentor and like a very good friend. This was not because of him, but it was my first workshop ever. And I was sitting in the corner of the room and I thought I was going to have a panic attack. Like I just became convinced that I was going to like die. And so henceforth sat by the door for the rest of the semester, lest I passed out. I did not. But yeah, I was terrified when I got here, and it ended up being I moved back very recently. It's a really wonderful place to be a writer. The community of Iowa City sort of at large is very creative, very writerly, very, people who are supportive of creative ideas and creative work. And the workshop especially was I had the most lovely group of classmates who, it was not very competitive. It was very supportive. I had a number of Deshaun Winslow, who had a book come out, Regina Porter. Several of my classmates had books come out, within like a month of me. And so it was a really sort of magical couple of years. Yeah. Hence my coming back here. Yeah.
Do you have a history of panic attacks, or was that the first one? Or
no, it was this completely like out of nowhere. I'm a highly anxious person, but I think I was just so overwhelmed and I described it to my mom. My mom's a nurse, and I described it to her later, and she was like, yeah, that sounds like, classic panic attack symptoms, but I was fine. And thankfully Ethan Kanan is also a physician, so I guess he could have intervened if I needed it. But yeah, I was just so nervous. And so, sharing creative work is such an intimate, scary thing. And it was not something I'd ever done before because I was an English major, but I was a rhetoric major. So I'd never like given my fiction to other people. And suddenly it was like, I have this novel that I've been working on quietly for years. Like, and now I'm just going to hand it off to people. So it was highly overwhelming at the outset.
What does that mean to be an English rhetoric major?
It essentially means that I was trying to finish college as quickly as possible because I had also dropped out. I dropped out of college when I was 19 because I was pretty unhappy where I was. And then I got this job as a paralegal at a nonprofit. And I ended up staying there for 6 years. And then it was suddenly like I was 24 and I was like, I should probably finish college. And so I was trying to do it as quickly and cheaply as possible. So credit wise, I was closest to being just sort of a straight English major. So I just kind of ran the gamut instead of focusing on creative writing or literature. I sort of dabbled in all of them. So yeah, that was a weird few years as well.
I know. So what is this dropping out of multiple programs? But you made it through Iowa, right? And now you came back.
Yes, I did.
Live to tell.
Yes.
What is it about those situations that makes you change your mind? I mean, like I tried to drop out of business school, but everybody convinced me to stay, including the people at the business school. They like basically wouldn't let me drop out, but I was like, I'm out of here. Okay. I'm done. They're like, no.
How far into your program did you want to? Like, how long did you?
Well, so probably 3 months in, but it was during 9/11 and I had lost a friend and I really didn't want to be in Boston anymore. And I just was like, I can't deal with this. I can't even think straight. Because, when like you're grieving, it's really hard to focus.
Yeah.
And I was like surrounded by people who were like super bright. And I was already a non-traditional student. I didn't have panic attacks, but I might as well have. I mean, I don't think I spoke for like months on end.
Oh gosh, that sounds horrible. Yeah.
Feeling so intimidated and everything. But eventually I came around, but it took a while. So I know that feeling. However, I didn't like pull the trigger and drop out. But now Now, so I want to hear, like, to make it over that finish line twice, like what gets you there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the first time I was at a very, very tiny private liberal arts college in rural Illinois, Knox College. And I had come from a really big high school and a really big family. And I was suddenly just in this tiny town with, in this tiny school. And I was just miserable. And I was also, at the time I was there, this is just sort of a comical happenstantial thing. There were dead crows all over the campus. And I still don't know if there was just some mass crow flu but it was this really ominous thing that you would just walk outside and there were dead birds everywhere. But I was just miserable. That's a really weird story. So.
No, that's I feel like I'm reading a novel now. This is great. The girl.
I know I've tried to write it into a project. It hasn't made it yet. But yeah, that time I think I find the notion of, that we're supposed to know at 18 what we want to do with our lives is so ludicrous to me. And I have friends now who have teenage kids, and I'm just I have such empathy for being that age and for not knowing what you want to do, because of course some people do, and that's great. But I had no idea what I wanted to do. I had a bunch of ideas that I thought, would be valid career paths or fruitful career paths. And I was 18. And so I didn't know. So I dropped out then just more for, practical reasons. It was a very expensive school. And I knew that I wasn't, taking advantage of it in the way that I should have been. But when I dropped out of graduate school, that was also a very financially unsound decision. But I was 3 months into my degree and my father died very, very suddenly and very unexpectedly.
Sorry.
And yeah, thank you. And so I think, it was horrible for, every possible reason, but I think it also made me sort of re-examine what I was doing. And my parents my mom is very, very supportive of, whatever their kids have wanted to do. And so it wasn't like I felt like this pressure to finish this degree because of my parents. I was putting pressure on myself. But I think losing my dad, I looked at the world in this different way, what matters, and what, kind of got me through that year, which was such a weird year. And I had bed bugs twice. It was just a miserable, also in rural Illinois. It was not a great time. But the thing that kind of kept me sane was working on this book. And it was kind of this space that I could retreat into in the evenings. And it was, so I was going to my classes and sort of going through the motions and reading theoretically about all of these psychological concepts and, all of these theoretical problems that people could have. And I was myself having, actual problems. And I found fiction a sort of more fruitful and therapeutic way to work through some of those things. So I remember calling my mom and telling her I was dropping out. And I said, I think I'm going to, apply to MFA programs. And she said, great, come on home. She was very, very supportive. And so, yeah, I decided that I would give it a year and that if nothing happened, I would go back. And I knew that I could, my credits would be saved. So I knew I could come back if it didn't work out. So I applied to, I think, 12 MFA programs. And during that year, I was a nanny for a while. I was a temp. I worked at the National Flute Association, which is probably the weirdest job I've ever had. And I have to clarify that I'm not saying flu like influenza. I'm talking about the woodwind instrument. And I'm not a musician. So it was a very strange job. And then I got into Iowa. And so it was really, it's not a path that I can add, I wouldn't advise other people to do this. I went into, tons and tons of student loan debt, and not for Iowa, but for my social work degree. And it was a huge risk, but it felt right at the time. And so I think, it's just an example of one of those things that you can't really plan that very fortunately worked out well for me, but just as easily could have not.
Oh, can I ask what happened to your dad? You don't have to answer.
Oh, no, he had a heart attack. He had sort of heart problems since I was a kid. It was 63. Very young, very healthy otherwise. So totally, totally unexpected. Yeah. And we were very close. So, and in a lot of ways, the father in my novel is not my dad, but is sort of an homage to good dads and to, dads who are reverent of having daughters. So that was kind of my way to work through that.
And what are you working on now?
I'm working on I say a new book. I've been working on it for what feels like a billion years because I started it when I was in graduate school. I'm working on another novel that is about marriage. And if the most fun we ever had is kind of more of a pulling the lens back and looking at a whole family. This is sort of delving more deeply into the nuances of a marriage. So putting it a little bit more under the microscope.
Are you married? Am I allowed to ask that?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, I'm not. Yes, you're allowed to ask that. I am not.
That's one of those questions you're not allowed to ask people. Aren't you like not allowed to ask? Somebody the other day said it was like not even PC to ask if you had kids, or can I even say PC? Anyway, I'm just getting myself into trouble. Okay, I'm done.
There's no judgment here.
Well, that sounds very interesting. And I feel like, especially this year, a lot of marriages have become highly dissected and thought about intimately, as everybody's been stuck inside with their spouses. So.
Right. Looking more deeply at their marriages than perhaps they want to.
Yes, perhaps it's true.
Yeah.
So what advice would you have for aspiring authors?
My very pat answer that sounds really smug and that I don't always follow myself is to just keep writing. So write as much as you can, try to develop a writing everyday routine if you can, and to read all the time. And I think that sounds so simplistic, but I forget how sort of necessary that is. Like, I think I go through periods of difficulty writing. And I realize in hindsight, it's because I'm not reading enough. I'm not being externally stimulated. And I think if you get so deeply into a project that you're just you've got blinders onto everything else, you're setting yourself up for not great writing, possibly. So I'm usually reading like 7 books at once. I've been that way since I was little. I have very sort of, fleeting attention, but reading a lot.
What 7 books are you reading now?
Oh gosh, what am I reading right now? I am rereading a novel by Dan. I never know how to say his last name. Dan Chon, I believe. You Remind Me of Me, which I loved like 10 years ago. So I'm resurrecting that. I just finished My Sister, the Serial Killer. Did you read that?
Mm-mm.
I loved it. Oh, it was it was really, really fun. It's also this really physically tiny book. So it's like the perfect bedtime reading. Oh, I just started We Begin at the End.
Yes.
Have you read that?
Chris Whitaker?
Yes,
I read that. Yes. I just had him on the podcast.
Oh, cool. Okay. I've heard that's the only book I've ever tried to pull strings to get an early copy of.
Oh, that's funny.
And I failed because we don't have the same publisher, but I bought it the day it came out, which I also almost never do. So I'm listening to that as an audiobook and really enjoying it.
If you ever are desperate for an early copy of something, just send me an email. If you're desperate again for an early copy, just get in touch.
Thank you. You're going to regret saying that.
I'm not saying that to everyone listening, but I am saying it to you, Claire.
Oh, thank you.
If you need a favor, every so often, I tend to get a lot of books, which is really, really exciting. Sometimes I get multiple copies and I don't even know what to do with them. So just let me know.
Oh, great. Thank you. I'll keep surfacing. Yes, that's great. Thanks.
The one question I really have also is there's so much, so many people I have on this podcast are in the midst of book publicity craziness, right? It's either right before it starts or right in the middle of it or after it or whatever. And you're just on this sort of whirlwind of interviews. And then after that, it's okay, well, that's done, right? I can go back to my writing and this and that and the other thing. So here, and I know it's obviously the beginning of your paperback launch, but after 2 years, looking back on that whole experience and now being able to be more perhaps clear-headed about what that whole thing was like in the book and everything, how do you feel looking back on that? How do you feel that whole experience even was, and how do you feel about your relationship to the book now, having been through all of that?
That's a really good question. I mean, in some ways, it's not that I don't remember, but it was such an overwhelming, writing a book is such a solitary, lonely often process. And you're so deeply in your head. And then suddenly it's you're talking to people constantly and having to be on all the time. And I wouldn't say I'm wholly introverted, but I'm more of an introvert than I am an extrovert. And so I think, part of me was just, you kind of go into this other mode and you get better at it. I think, I shudder to think of some things I said in early interviews. So maybe it's good that you and I haven't met because I'm probably slightly more articulate than I'm not terribly articulate now, but probably slightly more than I used to be. But it's such a different thing. And I think my relationship to the book, I guess I've become, in some ways I feel closer to it. And in some ways I feel, I can speak about it more objectively. Because again, right at the outset of the book coming out, or even, we did a lot of pre-pub stuff, I had just finished writing it. So I was really protective of these characters who felt like, sort of real people to me. And I was also kind of just used to being alone in my apartment, never talking to anyone. And now, it's kind of like this autonomous thing, not autonomous fully, but it's this thing in the world that has its own legs and its own life. And I think I realized that pretty shortly after the book came out, like, you have no control over who's going to read it or what they're going to think. And you're not going, and, I remember one of my professors, I don't remember who, saying, when you're writing, you have to know that, like, when someone any person in the world is reading your book, you're not going to be next to them being like, but no, you missed that, or like, pay attention to this, so it has to kind of speak for itself. So I think, I think my relationship is probably healthier, like less codependent with the novel now. That being said, I forget plot points that I've written. Like there are certain times when someone says something and I'm like, did that make it into the book? Like I have to go back and check, just because I haven't read my own book in, a while. So it's hard to remember sometimes. It's a long book. So I should read it again before the paperback comes out. I'll add that to my stack. Yeah. You also feel like a sociopath reading your own book. I don't know if you feel that, like, it just seems like a very sort of like masturbatory, like, I don't know. At least it's not like on the train or something.
We will not tell anyone. You just stay right there and do it. You don't have to tell a soul. Okay. No one will catch you. Maybe you don't do it at a restaurant, but even if you did, that would be like hilarious marketing. That would actually be so funny if you had like some sort of like spotting authors in the wild reading their own books, and like, like what was that thing, like not Tamagotchi, but the thing that everybody played, that game that, like, I don't want my kids to play, where you have to spot things. Do you know
the Pokemon game, where people would be like, yes.
It should be like a Pokemon Go, but it's authors reading their books in public. And like, if you got it, you would get like 20 points. And like, I don't know.
Yeah.
You see like a whole thing. Anyway, never mind. My mind is like.
Totally.
Okay, never mind.
We'll pursue this.
Yes. We'll pursue Author Go or something. And that will allow you to comfortably read your book without feeling weird. So.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I appreciate it.
Anytime. All right. Well, Claire, thank you so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books, and good luck on your next project. And I will try to catch you in the wild reading your own book, and we'll see what happens.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
And congrats on the paperback.
Oh, thank you. Thanks.
Welcome. Okay. Take care.
All right. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens and at Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Also sign up for my newsletter at zibbyowens.com and sign up for my virtual book club and meet lots of authors on Zoom every other week. Thanks so much to Steve and Ryan at Texture Sound for the sound editing. And thank you to Morning Moon Productions for providing this fantastic intro and outro music.